Jupiter in the 11th house in Leo. This video will get into all the ins and outs of that, and we'll see how it actually works in a real world case using the example chart of Tracy Lords. To understand Jupiter in Cancer in the 11th house, the first thing we want to understand is Jupiter in the 11th house. So that's exactly what we covered in episode 1 of this series. If you want to know the nuances and the ins and outs of that, I'll put a link to that video in the description below. The summary is Jupiter in the 11th house signifies being wealthy, being a performer or being very outgoing, and having a non-authoritarian attitude. So now that we know what Jupiter in the 11th house represents, we also want to ask the same questions about what Jupiter in Leo represents. I also have done a video explaining that in detail. If you want to know all the nuances of it, I'll put a link to that video in the description below. But for now, let's at least get the summary. Basically speaking, Jupiter in Leo signifies being productive and reproductive, like being sexually oriented. And it also symbolizes being very commanding and dominant. Now, we know what Jupiter in the 11th house represents, and we know what Jupiter in Leo represents. There's one more thing we can do to make sure we fully understand what Jupiter should symbolize in the 11th house in Leo, and that's to think about the lordships that are necessitated by the fact that Jupiter is in Leo and it's the 11th house. That might sound complicated, but let me explain it. It's actually kind of simple. If Leo is the 11th house, then Jupiter's signs, which are Sagittarius and Pisces, have to be the 3rd and the 6th. So therefore, if Jupiter is in Leo in the 11th house, it means the Lord of the 3rd and the Lord of the 6th is in the 11th house. Just notice that the 3rd and the 6th and the 11th houses are 3 of the 4 Upachaya houses. Upachaya means the building houses. The houses where you can amass things out of nothing and continually gain more and more and more. So having the 3rd and the 6th in the 11th is very synergistic for the whole dynamic of Upachaya. So I would describe this person, the person with this placement, as a builder, not as a construction worker, but as a builder. They build up themselves. So they're the type of person that can go from rags to riches, that type of thing. What does the 3rd house symbolize? Initiative and strength. And what does the 6th house symbolize? Problems and toughness. And all of these topics are going into the 11th house, which signifies performance talent and the ability to make profit. So what do you get when you sew all of that symbolism together into some cohesive ideas? Well, one thing is that they seem to be very indomitable, because the 3rd house has a lot of strength and the 6th house has a lot of toughness, and it's gone into the place that becomes a talent. So strength and toughness is their talent. It means they're quite strong. You can't really dominate them. Also, they probably have a lot of ambition and enterprise or appetite. And that's because the 3rd house is about initiative and the 11th house is about getting profit. And the 6th house just gives strength to things. Now that we know what Jupiter in the 11th house symbolizes and what Jupiter in Leo symbolizes and what the 3rd and 6th Lord in the 11th house symbolizes, all we need to do is put the 3 of these sets of symbols together and connect the dots between them. So the most important dots to connect, first of all, Jupiter in the 11th house is non-authoritarian. But you might have noticed that Jupiter in Leo is not really non-authoritarian, is it? It's commanding. And the 3rd and the 6th lords in the 11th house is very dominant and indomitable. So the native who has Jupiter in Leo in the 11th house is very dominant, kind of possibly to a fault. So they'd be very strong, very self-confident, and unyielding and defiant. They're the type of person that can do what you told them they couldn't do. In fact, they'll want to do the thing that you said was impossible to do. Another way that the dots connect between all these three sets of symbols is that Jupiter in the 11th is very wealthy. Jupiter in Leo is very productive. And the third and the sixth lord in the 11th house is very ambitious and enterprising. So these people want to make something of themselves. They want to make money. They want to build an empire. So an example chart is always extremely helpful to put a face on some of these concepts and also to see how the basic idea of what something should symbolize really works or doesn't work in a particular chart. So the example that I have for you today is Tracy Lords. She's a very, very good example of both of these interpretations. Self-building, building her own empire from literally zero. From having nothing and being at the mercy of fate. But no, she decides she's going to make her own fate. And also this dominance thing. She's going into a situation, which is the adult industry, where she is going to be the victim. But instead, what she does is she turns the whole situation upside down and makes the entire adult industry the victim, and she's the predator. That really, really well illustrates what is possible with Jupiter in Leo in the 11th house. But you may say, if I have Jupiter and Leo in the 11th house, does that mean I'm going to work in the adult industry? Probably not, because you probably have a different chart than Tracy Lords has. And that's really the important thing about looking at the whole chart and looking at example charts that have a placement in it. Don't expect everything about that person to be a result of that one particular thing. Like, it's not everything about Tracy Lords that comes from Jupiter and Leo in the 11th house. And don't expect that because you also have Jupiter in the 11th house in Leo that you should also have all the traits of Tracy Lords. So what is it particularly about her and her chart which makes it obvious that she's going to be involved in the sex industry? The big thing right off the bat is the 11th Lord and the 8th Lord and the 7th Lord, which involve Mars and Venus. All of these planets join in the 8th house. So the 11th is the house of pleasure. The 7th is the house of intercourse. The 8th is the house of sexuality. Mars and Venus, putting them together is sexuality, and putting it in the 8th house, it's all sexuality. But she's very unusual or strange, or you could maybe say weird about the sexuality. Why is that? How would you see that in the chart? Well, that's pretty evident from what's going on with the ascendant. It's just K2 right on the ascendant. So you expect a very unconventional or unusual person. Putting the two of those in the same chart, you have a person who's very unconventional about sexuality. Furthermore, and a very, very, very important thing to notice in this chart is the 7th house, where there's a debilitated Saturn and almost practically exactly conjoined with Rahu. So don't forget that if it's exactly on the 7th house cusp, that means it's exactly aspecting the ascendant and therefore very influential on this person as an individual. So the interpretation of this whole thing is that she's very much defined by this Saturn debilitated in the 7th house with Rahu, which means a very weird, unusual, unconventional approach to intercourse and social interactions. So you might ask, how come this Saturn debilitated with Rahu in the 7th house didn't ruin her? It seems like a pretty terrible thing to have. So how come she was able to make something very amazing out of her life? A lot of it has to do with Jupiter in the 11th house and Leo, and how these people have the capacity to never give up and to do the impossible and to create riches from rags. But in addition to that, even the Saturn itself in her chart has very redeeming qualities too. So for example, the fact that Saturn is the lord of the 5th, and which is a trine, and it's in an angular house, the 7th, with a node, it looks like a very terrible thing because it's debilitated with a node, but it has another facet to it where it's a Raja Yoga. And it is very, very strongly aspected by the Jupiter. And furthermore, she does have the 9th Lord Mercury in the 9th house, Gemini. So she does have some good fortune and good luck coming. And that comes through her intellect her ability to figure things out faster than other people. So I think you can see now and appreciate how important it is to look at the whole chart, because a particular interpretation, like the interpretation of Jupiter and Leo in the 11th house, it's like a seed. And the actual interpretation that you get for a person is like the way the seed has grown. So if you grow seeds under different conditions, you get different results. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tara-Bala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.